The valley stopped laughing at Ruth Ann Keller at 4:17 inches the morning. That was when the first orchard alarm failed, the sprinkler lines froze in the dark, and young peach buds across Mercy Valley began dying by the acre. Men who had mocked Ruth's rusted smudge pots were suddenly driving with headlights on. EIF to foremen, weather stations, anyone who could explain how a predicted cold snap had turned into a killing frost. But Ruth was already outside. At 74, with a wool coat over her nightgown and soot on both hands, she moved between the peach rows like she was following footsteps only she could see. 1 pot at the ridge, 2 near the low draw, 3 where the wind always dropped before dawn. Under her arm was Caleb's old frost journal, its pages stained with smoke, rain, and what looked like old peach juice. Her son Daniel had called those pages useless. Marla Voss from Southern Ridge Fruit had called the pots an eyesore. The county extension man said Ruth was confusing memory with farming. They all believed modern sensors and overhead sprinklers had made Caleb's old methods obsolete. Maybe Ruth had believed it too, until she saw the blue paint marks on the pots line up with a row of vanished cabins no one in the valley talked about anymore. By morning, her orchard would be the only one still holding bloom. But frost was not the deepest thing those pots had survived. And before Mercy Valley saw what was hidden in the smoke, they would have to watch an old woman choose between saving her farm and obeying people who had decided she was finished. Stay with Ruth Ann Keller for this story, because some promises are not written on paper. They are marked in smoke, rust, and old ground people would rather forget. And sometimes, the thing everyone calls worthless is the only thing still protecting the truth. 2 days before the frost, Ruth Ann Keller stood outside the packing shed while half of Mercy Valley pretended not to stare. The shed had once smelled of cedar crates, ripe peaches, and Caleb Keller's pipe tobacco. Now its paint peeled in gray strips, the loading ramp sagged, and the orchard behind it looked more alive than the bank account that was supposed to keep it running. That was the trouble with spring. It could make a dying farm look healthy. Marla Voss stepped around a rusted smudge pot as if it might stain her shoes. She wore a cream jacket too clean for orchard mud and carried a leather folder stamped with the Southern Ridge Fruit logo in gold. Behind her, 2 company men took pictures of the shed, the fence, the old tractor, and the blackened pots sitting between rows. Daniel Keller stood beside them, jaw tight. "Mama," he said, "please listen before you say no." Ruth kept one gloved hand on the nearest pot. Its lid was crooked. Its handle had been wired back on. Across the top, a faded blue mark cracked through the soot. Caleb had painted that mark more than 30 years ago and told her never to cover it with new paint. Marla opened the folder. "Mrs. Keller, Southern Ridge is prepared to offer a 3-year purchasing agreement," she said. "Premium rate this season if your bloom holds, and renewal options if the orchard passes inspection." Daniel looked at Ruth with tired eyes. "That contract pays the fertilizer note. It buys us time with the bank. It fixes the north roof." He did not say medicine. He did not say taxes. But Ruth heard all of it. Marla turned a page. "There are only a few conditions." The men near the truck stopped pretending not to listen. "The property needs cleanup before final approval," Marla continued. "No obsolete frost devices. No open burn equipment. No unregistered fuel containers. The old cabin foundations behind the lower rows should be cleared. And these," she tipped her shoe toward the smudge pot, "will have to go." A short laugh came from someone by the road. Hank Bell, Ruth's neighbor, rubbed his neck. "Don't take it hard, Ruth. Nobody uses those old smokers anymore." Lyle Pritchard from the county extension office folded his arms. "They're a liability. Modern overhead systems are safer and more predictable." Ruth looked down the hill. 56 smudge pots sat among the trees, dented and black, ugly enough for people to mistake age for uselessness. Some leaned in the grass. Some had lids that no longer fit. All of them carried marks Caleb had made by hand. Daniel stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Mama, they make the place look abandoned." That hurt more than Marla's checklist. Ruth looked at her son. He was not trying to shame her. Fear had worn him thin. Fear of the bank. Fear of another bad season. Fear that loving his mother meant dragging her into the present, even if it broke her heart. Marla's smile stayed polite. "With respect, Mrs. Keller, sentiment is not a frost plant." The words landed cleanly. A few workers looked away. Ruth moved her thumb across the blue mark. "When do you need them gone?" Daniel almost smiled. 48 hours, Marla said. Final inspection is Friday morning. Ruth nodded once. Then she said, no. The quiet after that was full of embarrassment. Daniel stared at her. You're choosing scrap metal over the farm. Ruth reached into her apron pocket and pulled out Caleb's frost journal. The cover was soft from use, its corners dark with smoke and rain. She opened it to a page circled in blue pencil. The date at the top was April 6. Tomorrow's date. Lyle frowned. Mrs. Keller, that journal is 40 years old. Ruth looked past him to the lower drawer, where cold air always settled first. So is the wind, she said. Marla slipped the contract back into her purse. When frost comes, Mrs. Keller, memory does not save crops. Daniel turned away and walked toward his truck. The company men lowered their cameras. Hank Bell shook his head as if he had just watched a woman throw away her last chance. Ruth stayed beside the pot until they all left. Only then did she kneel and brush dead grass from its base. Beneath the rusted belly, half hidden in dirt, was another blue mark. Not on the lid, where a farmer would mark equipment. On the ground beneath it, beside that mark, pressed into the clay, Ruth saw the edge of something metal. She did not dig it out yet. She only looked toward the lower rows, where the old worker cabins had once stood, and whispered Caleb's old frost warning. Smoke remembers. Ruth had not always been the kind of woman who kept old things because she was afraid to let them go. When she first came to Mercy Valley, she was 19, with 2 dresses, 1 pair of church shoes, and a laugh Caleb Keller said could make a mule turn its head. Caleb was 24 then, lean as a fence rail, sun-browned, and poor enough to know the exact sound a coin made when it was the last one in his pocket. They did not own the orchard at first. They worked it. Southern Ridge leased the high rows to men who could afford equipment and rented the lower cabins to seasonal families who came when the trees needed pruning, thinning, picking, or saving from weather that did not care who owned the land. Ruth washed crates and packed peaches. Caleb fixed broken ladders, sharpened blades, hauled fuel, and listened more than he spoke. That was one thing Ruth loved about him. He paid attention to people other men looked past. In those years, the lower draw behind the peach rows was alive with voices. Children chased each other between cabin steps. Women hung work shirts on lines stretched from pine to pine. Men came in after dark with hands sticky from peach sap and backs bent from ladders. There was always coffee boiling somewhere. Always beans. Always a radio playing low in Spanish, English, or mountain gospel, depending on which cabin door stood open. Caleb knew every family by name. The Ruizes were in cabin C4. Mateo Ruiz was a small man with silver at his temples and eyes that missed nothing. He had worked orchards from Texas to Carolina, and he could smell frost before the county extension office could measure it. Caleb used to say Mateo did not watch the weather. He listened to the ground. Ruth had laughed the first time she heard that. Then came the April frost of 1967. The forecast called for a light cold, nothing more. A few growers slept through it. A few turned on their new overhead sprinklers and trusted water to make a shield of ice around the blooms. Caleb believed them. He was young, proud of learning modern ways, and tired of being treated like a hired hand with muddy boots. By midnight, the wind shifted. By 2, the lower rows were silver. By 3, the buds snapped between Ruth's fingers like burned paper. She remembered standing in the dark, while Caleb cursed under his breath, running from valve to valve, trying to force water through a system that had already lost pressure. The pumps coughed. The lines rattled. The orchard seemed to hold its breath, then give up all at once. Mateo Ruiz did not give up. He came up from the cabins with 5 men, 2 women, and a boy no older than 13. They rolled out the old smudge pots Southern Ridge had left stacked behind the shed, black and dented from some earlier decade. Caleb told him they were obsolete. Mateo looked at the hollow below the trees. Cold air does not know what year it is, he said. He did not place the pots in neat rows. He placed one by the ridge where the wind broke, 2 at the low draw where cold collected, 3 near the cabin lane where smoke could crawl under the branches instead of rising too fast. He taught Caleb to watch the smoke, not the flame. White smoke lifting straight up meant the heat was leaving. Low smoke meant the orchard still had a blanket. Ruth watched Caleb's face change. Not from shame, from recognition. For the first time, he understood that farming was not only machines, pumps, forecasts, and company rules. It was memory held in hands, It was knowing where cold slept before dawn. It was listening when people with no land of their own understood the land better than men who signed the papers. They did not save the whole crop that year, but they saved the lower rows. For weeks afterward, Caleb followed Mateo whenever he could. He asked about wind, slope, damp bark, swollen buds, and the smell of frost in creek bottoms. Mateo answered if Caleb asked right. He refused if Caleb came with pride in his voice. Write it down. Mateo finally told him one evening. Caleb found an old account ledger with half the pages unused. On the cover, he wrote Frost Journal in pencil. Ruth still remembered the way he sat at the kitchen table that night, copying every detail Mateo had taught him. Not just temperatures, names, cabin numbers, pot locations, wind directions, who had stood where. That was when the blue marks began. Caleb painted them on the lids first, so he would know which pot belonged at which cold pocket. Later, he painted smaller marks on stones, fence posts, and sometimes the ground itself. Ruth thought it was excessive. Caleb said a night of frost could make a man forget what saved him. Mateo said something different. Smoke remembers where people stood. Caleb wrote it inside the journal cover. For a while, Ruth believed the sentence was only about farming. A beautiful phrase, maybe. A worker's wisdom. One more piece of orchard superstition that had turned out to be truer than the county bulletins. Then, 3 years later, another frost came. That one was worse. By morning, Southern Ridge had lost thousands of dollars in bloom, and someone had to be blamed. The company men said the workers had set the pots wrong. They said fuel had been wasted. They said cabin C4 had ignored orders. Ruth heard Mateo arguing near the shed, his voice low but sharp. She saw Caleb standing nearby with his jaw clenched and both hands closed into fists. He knew the accusation was wrong. Ruth knew he knew. But she was pregnant with Daniel then. They had just been offered a chance to buy the neglected lower acres on credit. One word against Southern Ridge could have ended everything before their family began. So Caleb said nothing. Mateo Ruiz left Mercy Valley before summer. Cabin C4 went empty. Then C3. Then C5. Within a few years, the cabins were boarded shut, then torn down, then spoken of as if no one real had ever lived there. Southern Ridge called the area vacant worker housing. The county maps called it unused land. But Caleb kept the journal. He kept the smudge pots. And whenever Ruth asked why he would not let the past rest, he would touch the blue marks and say only one thing. Some debts don't ask to be paid in money. For years, Ruth thought he meant the orchard. Only now, kneeling beside the pot with the metal edge showing in the clay, she began to fear he had meant the people the orchard had survived by forgetting. After the trucks disappeared down Keller Road, Ruth Ann Keller stayed in the orchard until the sun slipped behind the ridge. She did not go inside to cry. She did not call Daniel. She did not open the Southern Ridge contract again, though Marla had left a copy on the packing shed table as if temptation needed paper to breathe. Instead, Ruth went from pot to pot with Caleb's frost journal tucked under one arm and an old feed pencil in her pocket. There were 56 smudge pots left. Once, there had been more. Some had been sold during a hard winter, when Daniel was still a boy and the heating bill had come due. Some had rusted through at the bottom. A few had been crushed by a falling peach limb during an ice storm. Caleb had mourned those like a man losing witnesses. Ruth had not understood that then. Now she walked the rows slowly, counting what remained. To anyone else, the pots were ugly things. Black metal bellies, crooked lids, wire-mended handles, soot layered so thick on some rims that it came off on Ruth's gloves like coal dust. Their legs sank unevenly into the soil. Their vents were warped. Their seams showed orange rust where years of frost, rain, and heat had eaten through paint. A clean orchard did not have things like that. A modern orchard had straight irrigation lines, white tanks, sensor boxes, weather towers, frost alarms, and overhead sprinklers clicking in rows like they belonged to the future. Southern Ridge knew how to sell that kind of orchard. Aerial photographs, corporate brochures. Words like efficiency, compliance, sustainability. Ruth's smudge pots did not photograph well. They looked like stubbornness. That was what Daniel saw. A mother refusing help. A farm embarrassing itself in public. A line of rusted black cans standing between him and the contract that might finally let him sleep at night. That was what Marla saw. Liability. Mess. An old widow's attachment to a dead man's equipment. That was what Lyle saw. Outdated practice. Fire risk. A method that belonged in county archives, not among fruit trees still expected to make money. Even Hank Bell, who had known Ruth 40 years, saw only relics. He remembered the smoke, the smell, the mess on laundry lines, the way old orchard men used to claim they could hold back frost with flame and prayer. Nobody saw the marks. Not really. Ruth knelt beside the first pot and wiped soot from the lid. A blue slash crossed the metal, faded but deliberate. She opened Caleb's journal to the first marked page and found a matching slash beside the words Ridge East, wind break before dawn. That one made sense. She moved to the second pot. 2 dots. In the journal, 2 dots marked lower draw, cold pools under dead calm. That made sense too. But the third pot had a blue half circle near the handle, and when Ruth searched the journal, the half circle did not appear beside a row of trees. It appeared beside an old note written in Caleb's cramped hand. C. 2 porch line. Ruth looked toward the lower acres. There was no porch there now, only grass, clay, blackberry vines, and the faint square shadows where cabins had once stood. The county called that section unused land. Marla called it cleanup. Caleb had called it by number. Ruth's fingers tightened on the journal. She went on. The fourth pot had 3 small strokes painted near the vent. The journal matched them to North Hollow, but below that, in lighter pencil, Caleb had written bellboys stood here till sunrise. Ruth did not know which bellboys. Hank's family? Hired workers? Children grown old and buried now? The fifth pot had no number at all, only a smear of blue paint near the base, nearly hidden by rust. Ruth tipped it carefully and heard something shift inside. Not fuel. Something heavier. She pried the warped lid open and looked down into the belly. The inside smelled of old oil, ash, and damp iron. At the bottom, beneath flakes of rust, sat 3 smooth stones wedged against one side. Stones did not belong in a fuel pot. Ruth reached in and lifted one out. It was flat and river-worn, with a faint blue dot painted on one face. Caleb had put weight in the pot on purpose, but not to make it burn better, to keep it from being moved, or to make someone wonder why it had to stay. By the 10th pot, Ruth had stopped thinking like a farmer's widow and started thinking like a woman reading a map made by a man who had been afraid to label it plainly. Some marks matched frost logic. Some matched wind. Some matched slope. But others pointed to vanished things. Cabin steps, porch lines, a well cover, a wash shed, a sycamore stump where children once tied rope swings. The orchard Ruth had known was not the only orchard Caleb had preserved. Beneath the living trees was another Mercy Valley, one made of work songs, borrowed tools, tin plates, wet boots, and people whose names had been rubbed off official paper. Ruth sat back on her heels. For the first time, she understood why Caleb had never wanted new paint on the pots. New paint would have made them look useful again, but it would have covered what they remembered. Near sunset, she reached pot 17. It stood crooked at the edge of the lower draw, close to where Marla wanted the cabin foundations cleared. The lid had been dented almost flat. Its handle was missing. Most of the blue mark had worn away, but a small painted corner remained near the rim. Ruth searched the journal. For several minutes, she found nothing. Then a loose page slipped from the back cover and fell into the grass. It was not a frost chart. It was a rough sketch of the lower cabins. C mort, C high, C ba, and beside C4, Caleb had drawn a small circle with the number 17 inside it. Ruth stopped breathing for a moment. Cabin que patru, Mateo Ruiz. The Mon Kim lore she had seen earlier was still half buried beneath the pot's rusted belly. Ruth pulled her glove tighter and scraped at the clay with her fingers. The metal edge widened. Tin, maybe. Thin. Rectangular. Not part of the pot. A tag. The letters were too dirty to read. She could have dug it out then. She could have carried it to the porch, washed it under the pump, and forced the past to speak before she was ready to hear it. But the light was fading, and tomorrow was April 6. The date Caleb had circled. The date frost might come. Ruth looked at the 56 pots, then at the rows of peach bloom glowing pale in the last light. Southern Ridge wanted them gone before inspection. Daniel wanted them gone before the bank lost patience. The whole valley wanted them gone because old things made people uncomfortable when they refused to stay quiet. Ruth closed the journal. No, she whispered. Then she went to the shed, took Caleb's old handcart from the wall, and began pulling the first smudge pot back toward the ridge, where the blue mark said it belonged. By 7 the next morning, Ruth Ann Keller had already moved 6 smudge pots. Her back burned. Her knees throbbed. Her gloves were black with soot, and every time she bent to hook Caleb's old handcart beneath another rusted belly, her breath came shorter than she wanted to admit. But the journal was open on the cart seat. Ridge East. Lower Draw. C. 2 Porch Line. North Hollow. Seabon. The words did not let her stop. She pulled the pots one at a time through wet grass, leaving dark tracks in the dew. Some dragged easily once she tipped them right. Others caught on roots or sank into soft clay. One had a bottom so rusted that Ruth feared it would tear open before she got it 10 feet. Another was heavier than the rest, weighted with stones Caleb had hidden inside so no one would move it without wondering why. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, smoke was not rising yet, but gossip was. A pickup slowed on Keller Road. Then another. By 8, Hank Bell had walked over from his orchard, with a coffee cup in one hand and pity on his face. "Ruth," he called, "you trying to kill yourself before the frost gets a chance?" She did not look up. "Morning, Hank." He watched her drag pot 17 toward the lower draw. "You know Marla's people are coming back tomorrow." "I know. You know Daniel's about worried sick." "I know that too." Hank sighed. "Then maybe don't make it worse." That made her stop for a moment. She stood with both hands on the cart handle, gray hair loose from its pins, mud on her hem, and Caleb's journal pressed open by a stone. "I am trying not to," she said. Hank did not know what to do with that answer. By mid-morning, 2 teenage workers from Bell Orchard had parked near the fence. They leaned against the hood of their truck, filming with their phones as Ruth tried to roll a pot over a shallow ditch. "Mrs. Keller's bringing back the smoke age," one of them said. The other laughed. "Somebody tell the weather app it's been replaced by a grandma and a bucket of fire." Ruth heard every word. She kept pulling. The old Ruth might have turned and told them their grandfathers had once begged for smoke on nights like this. The tired Ruth might have gone inside and shut the door. But the woman holding Caleb's journal did neither. She moved the pot 3 more feet. Then Lyle Pritchard arrived in his county truck. He stepped out with a clipboard, though Ruth suspected the clipboard was mostly there to make his worry look official. He walked carefully between the rows, avoiding mud, soot, and anything that might make his khaki pants seem part of the farm. "Mrs. Keller," he said, "I need to advise you against operating these devices. I am not operating them. You're positioning them. That is not illegal." "No," Lyle admitted. "But if you light them, we may have a problem. Open flame equipment, fuel storage, smoke drift, liability near public roadways." Ruth straightened slowly. "Lyle, did your father ever use smudge pots?" His mouth tightened. "This is not about my father. It usually is, when a man hates something this much." A few boys by the fence laughed at that, but Lyle did not. He glanced down at the open journal and the blue pencil marks. For 1 second, his face changed. Not understanding. Not yet. But recognition that Ruth was not moving things randomly. Then Daniel's truck came too fast into the drive. He got out before the engine had fully died. "Mama?" His voice carried across the orchard. Ruth closed the journal halfway. Daniel walked toward her, looking at the pots, the handcart, the mud, the watching boys, Hank Bell, Lyle, and finally his mother. Shame and fear fought across his face. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Putting them where they belong. They belong in a scrap trailer." "No." He lowered his voice, but anger sharpened it anyway. "Southern Ridge called me this morning. Marla heard you were moving them back into the rows. News travels faster when people want it to be ugly." "This isn't ugly. This is dangerous." Daniel pointed toward the packing shed. "The bank gave us 30 days because I begged. Do you understand that? Begged. That contract is the only thing standing between you and losing this place." Ruth looked at him, and for a moment the orchard disappeared. She saw him at 7 years old, asleep on a crate, while Caleb checked frost lines at midnight. She saw him at 14, pretending not to cry after Caleb sold 3 good acres to pay a hospital bill. She saw a man now, trying to carry a farm he did not love the way she did, but feared losing because it was still his mother's home. "I understand more than you think," she said. "Then act like it." The words hit both of them. Daniel's face changed first. Regret came quickly, but pride held it behind his teeth. Ruth turned back to the pot. By afternoon, she tried a test burn. Not a full burn. Just enough to see which pots could breathe. The first one caught with a low cough of flame and then settled into a thin ribbon of smoke that slid between the trees exactly the way Caleb's journal described. The second would not light. Ruth cleaned the vent, tried again, and got only a bitter puff of black smoke that stung her eyes. The third smoked too fast, rising straight up instead of crawling low. The boys at the fence made a show of coughing. "Looks modern to me," one called. Then pot 17 tipped. Ruth had placed it near the lower draw, close to the old C4 mark. The ground there looked firm, but when the pot warmed, one leg sank into soft clay. The whole thing leaned, coughed smoke, and fell sideways with a dull iron thud. Daniel rushed forward, angry and frightened. "That's enough." Even Ruth could not answer right away. Smoke poured crookedly from the fallen pot, ugly and uncontrolled. Lyle stepped back, already reaching for his phone. Hank Bell shook his head. The teenage boys stopped laughing only because the failure was too plain to need help. And then Marla Voss arrived. She stepped from her SUV in the same cream jacket, took in the fallen pot, the smoke, the mud, the watching neighbors, and Ruth standing beside it with soot on her face. "Mrs. Keller," Marla said, "I think we have our answer." Daniel looked away. Marla's voice stayed calm enough to sound kind. Southern Ridge cannot attach its name to an orchard managed by memory instead of standards. Ruth said nothing. She was looking at the ground beneath pot 17. The fall had torn a shallow strip of clay loose. Where the metal edge had been half hidden the night before, a small rectangular tag now lay exposed, dirty but whole. Ruth bent down before anyone could stop her. With 2 fingers, she lifted it from the mud. The letters were scratched, but readable. Ruiz, que bon, and beneath that, stamped into the tin so faintly she almost missed it, was one more word: unpaid. Ruth did not show the tin tag to Marla Voss. Not yet. She closed her fingers around it until the sharp edge pressed a red line into her palm, then slipped it into the pocket of her apron as if it were only another piece of broken orchard scrap. Marla was still watching her. Daniel was still standing near the fallen pot with anger and fear caught in his face. Lyle Pritchard had his phone half raised, ready to document the failure of a method he had already decided was obsolete. Ruth gave them nothing. She only righted pot 17, checked the cracked leg, and said, "This one needs a stone under it." Daniel stared. "Mama, did you hear anything Marla just said?" "I heard all of it." "Then why are you still doing this?" Ruth looked at the lower draw, where cold air gathered even on warm evenings. "Because Frost does not care who holds the contract." That night, the first cold came. It was not the killing frost the radio warned about, not yet. The county weather station called it a dip, a test, a harmless brush with 33 degrees before dawn. Men in Mercy Valley laughed about it over supper. A few turned on their overhead systems for caution. Others did nothing. Ruth did not sleep. At 11, she put on Caleb's old canvas coat and carried a lantern to the shed. The Frost Journal lay open on the workbench. Beside it sat the tin tag, washed clean under the pump. Ruiz. Sibon. Unpaid. She had stared at that word until it stopped looking like a word and started feeling like a hand on her shoulder. At midnight, she filled 6 pots with old fuel she had strained twice through cloth. She did not light all 56. She was not foolish, no matter what people thought. Caleb's journal did not call for a full burn on a light frost. It called for a test line. Ridge East. Lower draw. C2 porch line. Cabon. North hollow. She placed them exactly where the blue marks said they belonged. Then she waited. The first pot caught badly, coughing black smoke straight upward. Ruth adjusted the vent and lowered the flame until the smoke thickened and dropped. The second smoked clean. The third nearly died before she opened the side draft. Pot 17 hissed, shuddered, and then released a low gray ribbon that did not rise. It crawled. That was the word Caleb had always used. Good smoke crawls before it climbs. Ruth stood still between the trees and watched it move. The smoke spread beneath the lowest limbs, slow and patient, sliding through the cold pocket like a blanket being pulled over a sleeping child. It did not cover the whole orchard. It did not need to. It settled where the journal said the cold would settle first. By 2 in the morning, frost silvered the grass outside the smoke line. Inside it, the ground stayed wet and dark. Ruth touched a peach bud with 2 fingers. It was cold, but not brittle. For the first time in 2 days, she let herself breathe. At sunrise, Hank Bell came over expecting to find smoke, mess, and proof that Ruth had wasted another night. Instead, he stopped at the fence. The lower rows of his orchard showed small brown burns along the youngest buds, not ruin, but damage enough for a grower's eye to fear. On Ruth's side, the low draw still held pink. Not perfect, not untouched, but alive. Hank walked into the row and pinched a bud gently. "Well," he said. Ruth was too tired to smile. "That a word or a prayer?" He looked embarrassed. "Maybe both." Lyle arrived 20 minutes later with a thermometer, a soil probe, and the stiff expression of a man hoping facts would save him from humility. He checked Ruth's lower draw, then Hank's matching slope, then Ruth's again. Daniel Camelast. He had not shaved. His hair was flat on one side. He looked at the smoke stains on his mother's coat, then at the living buds, then at the 6 pots placed in positions that made no sense to anyone who had not read Caleb's journal. "They held," he asked. "Some of them. Enough? For last night." Lyle cleared his throat. A smoke layer can sometimes raise the microclimate a few degrees in low spots. Hank gave him a look. "Yesterday it was liability." "It can be both," Lyle said, "but weaker than before." Ruth closed the journal. She knew better than to celebrate. The real frost had not come. 6 pots saving a low draw was not the same as 56 pots defending an orchard. And one mild night would not save the farm from the bank, Marla Voss, or a contract that could vanish with one phone call. But it was enough to prove one thing. Caleb had not been guessing. By noon, Ruth drove to the Mercy Valley Library with the tin tag wrapped in a handkerchief. The library had once been a feed store. Its floors still creaked like old boards remembered the weight of grain sacks. Behind the desk sat Miriam Pike, who had known Ruth since both of them wore their hair long and believed time moved slower than it did. Miriam unfolded the handkerchief and read the tag. "Ruiz," she said softly, "you remember them?" "I remember a boy," Miriam said. "Miguel, maybe. Or Mateo's grandson. He used to sit outside while his mother cleaned the Methodist church." Ruth leaned forward. "The county maps call those cabins vacant." Miriam's face changed. She went to the back room and returned with a box of brittle folders labeled Agricultural Housing Survey, 1964, 1971. The county had not digitized them. No one had thought old worker cabins worth the trouble. They found C4 on a yellowed sheet. Occupied. Mateo Ruiz. Sofia Ruiz. 3 dependents. Beside the entry was a pencil notation Ruth did not understand at first. Wages withheld pending frost review. Below that, in another hand, someone had stamped, "Vacated, no claim." Ruth read it twice. Then a third time. No claim. As if people with no money, no permanent address, and no lawyer had simply walked away from what they were owed because they wanted nothing. Miriam lowered herself into the chair beside Ruth. "What does your tag say?" Ruth opened her hand. "Ruiz. C4. Unpaid." The room seemed to grow quieter around them. Outside the window, Mercy Valley looked ordinary. Trucks passed. A dog barked. Somewhere, men were checking pumps and believing the next night would belong to modern systems, county forecasts, and clean equipment. Ruth looked down at the tag and understood that the Smudge pots had saved more than peach bloom. They had saved a location, a name, a debt. And if Caleb had marked one pot for cabin C4, then the other blue marks might not be random either. They might be all that remained of people the valley had learned to call temporary, because temporary people were easier to forget. Miriam touched the folder. "Ruth, if this is what it looks like, you need more than an old journal." Ruth nodded. But before she could answer, the library radio crackled behind the desk. A weather bulletin interrupted the noon farm report. The forecast had changed. The cold front had deepened. Mercy Valley was no longer expecting a light frost. By morning, the announcer said, temperatures could fall low enough to kill every exposed peach bloom in the valley. Ruth folded the tag back into the handkerchief. Then she reached for Caleb's journal. By late afternoon, Mercy Valley had stopped joking about the cold. The sky had gone the color of tin, not gray exactly, but hard and flat, with no softness left in it. Birds moved low through the orchard rows. The air had that strange stillness Ruth had learned to distrust, the kind that made every branch seem to wait. At 4 o'clock, the county weather alert changed. Not frost advisory. Freeze warning. By 5, the packing shed radio said temperatures could fall below 27 before dawn. By 6, every grower in Mercy Valley was moving. Trucks hauled fuel. Pumps were checked. Sprinkler heads were tested row by row. Men who had laughed at Ruth's smudge pots now stood under weather towers and watched numbers drop faster than the forecast had promised. The larger orchards turned on overhead systems early, trusting ice to protect the blossoms the way extension bulletins said it should. Ruth watched from her kitchen window. Then she tied Caleb's canvas coat around her shoulders and opened the back door. Daniel was already on the porch. For a moment, neither of them spoke. His truck sat by the shed with the tailgate down. In it were 3 cans of strained fuel, 2 bags of sand, a box of old matches, and every clean rag Ruth owned. "I'm not saying I understand," Daniel said. Ruth looked at him. He swallowed. "But I saw the lower rows this morning. That was not an apology." "Not yet. But it was a beginning. They worked until dark." Ruth read from Caleb's journal while Daniel moved the handcart. They did not place the pots in straight lines. That bothered him at first. He kept wanting order, rows, symmetry, something that looked like planning. Ruth showed him how Caleb had marked the ridge first, then the low draw, then the cabin line where the cold slid sideways before settling under the trees. "Why would a cabin line matter to Frost?" Daniel asked. Ruth looked toward the lower hollow. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it mattered to something else. He frowned, but he did not argue. By midnight, all 56 pots were placed. By 1, Ruth lit the first. The orchard filled slowly with small flames, each one low and controlled. Smoke gathered in ribbons, then widened. It did not rise the way Daniel expected. It crawled under the branches and drifted through the rows, catching in the low places, wrapping the tender bloom in a gray cover that smelled of oil, ash, and old weather. At 2:30, the first call came from Hank Bell. Daniel answered because Ruth's hands were black with soot. "Hank says his west pump is losing pressure," Daniel said. Ruth did not look up from the journal. "Tell him to drain the line before it freezes solid. He already tried. Then tell him to stop forcing it. He'll split the pipe." Daniel repeated the warning. Hank did not listen. At 3 to 10, lights moved along Keller Road. Not one truck now. Several. Growers checking fields. Men driving too fast. Someone shouted near Bell Orchard. A sprinkler line had burst. Water sprayed into freezing air and fell back as glittering ice over the grass. At 3:40, Lyle Pritchard's county truck pulled into the drive. He stepped out with a flashlight and no clipboard. That told Ruth more than words would have. "How bad?" she asked. "Worse than forecast," he said. Behind him, Marla Voss's SUV rolled to a stop. Daniel stiffened. Marla got out wearing a dark coat over her cream jacket, her hair pulled back, her face sharper than it had been in daylight. She looked past Ruth toward the smoking rows, then across the valley where sprinkler systems flashed under headlights like broken glass. "Southern Ridge has crews out everywhere," she said. "This freeze was not expected to hit this hard." Ruth adjusted a vent with the tip of Caleb's old wrench. Frost rarely asks permission. At 4:17 inches the morning, the valley failed. The first orchard alarm screamed from the ridge, then cut out. Bell Orchard lost pressure completely. 2 farms below the highway shut down pumps to keep lines from bursting. The big Southern Ridge block to the east glittered white under a sheet of ice too thick for the young bloom to survive. Men ran through rows with flashlights, kicking valves, shouting into phones, trying to make modern systems obey a cold that had already slipped past them. But in Ruth's lower rows, the smoke held. Not everywhere. Not perfectly. Some buds at the open edge burned brown. A few limbs near the road silvered despite the pots. Ruth knew loss when she saw it, and she would not lie to herself. But inside the smoke line, the blossoms stayed soft. Daniel saw it first. He had gone to check pot 17 near the old C4 mark. When he came back, his face had changed. "Mama," he said quietly. Ruth followed him down the row. The ground outside the smoke path was white. The grass cracked under their boots. But around pot 17, the clay was dark. The nearest branches wet but alive, and the smoke lay low as breath. Daniel reached up and touched a peach bud. It bent. It did not break. Marla stood several rows back, saying nothing. Lyle moved from pot to pot, taking readings with a small digital thermometer. He checked Ruth's row, then the road edge, then Hank's slope across the fence. His numbers told him what Pride did not want to. "This pocket is 4 degrees warmer," he said. Hank Bell, who had come over with ice on his coat and panic in his eyes, stared at the smudge pots like they had become something holy and inconvenient. 4 degrees, he repeated. Ruth closed her eyes briefly. 4 degrees was the difference between bloom and loss, between contract and foreclosure, between being laughed at and being needed. At first light, Mercy Valley looked wounded. Across the farms, whole sections of peach bloom had browned overnight. Sprinkler ice hung heavy on branches. Men walked their rows in silence, pinching buds, shaking their heads, doing the kind of math farmers did before admitting disaster. Ruth's orchard had damage too, but it was standing. The lower draw still held color. The ridgeline was scarred but alive. The cabin line, the strange crooked path Marla had called mess and Daniel had called madness, had preserved enough bloom to make every person at the fence go quiet. Lyle asked to see the journal. Ruth hesitated. Daniel noticed. "She doesn't have to hand it over," he said. It was the first time he had said something that defended the journal instead of apologized for it. Lyle lifted both hands. "I'm not taking it. I just want to understand the placement." Ruth opened the journal on the hood of Daniel's truck. Lyle studied the blue marks. His brow tightened. He turned one page, then another. Then he walked back to his truck and returned with a folded photocopy from the library folder Miriam had sent over after Ruth called before dawn. It was the old cabin survey. Lyle placed it beside Caleb's frost chart. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The blue marks matched the cold pockets, but they also matched the cabins. Kimot, Si-Hai, Xiba, Sibon. Each old cabin location had a pot. Each pot had a mark. And beside several marks, Caleb had written initials, not temperatures. Emi, Ehi, S, Ere, B, C, A-V. Marla stepped closer. "What are those?" she asked. Ruth watched her face carefully. "Names, maybe." Lyle turned the page. A loose sheet slipped free. Ruth recognized Caleb's handwriting immediately, but not the tightness of it. These were not farm notes. These were the words of a man writing something he was afraid to say aloud. Not frost damage, wage damage. "Ask vos." Marla went still. Daniel looked from the page to her. "Vos?" he said. The morning wind moved through the orchard, thinning the smoke at last. For the first time, everyone could see the pattern the pots had made across Ruth's land. Not rows. Not equipment placement. A map. Marla reached for the page. Ruth closed the journal before her fingers touched it. "No," Ruth said. Marla's polite voice returned, but it sounded thinner now. "Mrs. Keller, if Southern Ridge is mentioned in that book, we need to review it properly." Ruth looked past her, across the damaged valley, then down at the smudge pot still breathing smoke among living bloom. "You already had years to review it," she said. And for the first time since Marla Voss had stepped onto Keller land, she had no answer. By noon, Mercy Valley had become a place where men spoke softly. The frost had not killed every tree, but it had humbled every orchard. Whole blocks of peach bloom turned brown before breakfast. Sprinkler lines hung split and frozen from posts. Pumps smoked. Branches sagged under ice that had saved nothing. Along Keller Road, growers moved through their rows with pocket knives, cutting buds open to see whether there was still green life inside. Most found brown. At Ruth Ann Keller's orchard, there was damage too. She refused to pretend otherwise. The road edge had burned. The high row near the old tractor shed had lost half its bloom, but the lower draw, the cabin line, and the ridge pocket still held color. Enough color for peaches. Enough color for people to drive slowly past and stare. By early afternoon, 3 trucks had stopped at the fence. A local reporter left a card under a rock by the porch. Hank Bell came by with his hat in both hands and asked, without joking this time, whether Ruth might look at his west slope before the next cold night. Then Marla Voss returned. She did not come in the cream jacket. She came in dark jeans, boots, and a company vest with Southern Ridge fruit stitched over the heart. Behind her came 2 men Ruth had not seen before. One carried a tablet. The other carried a flat black case that looked too clean for any farm use. Daniel was standing by the packing shed when they arrived. Ruth watched from the doorway. Marla looked across the orchard and smiled with a careful kind of admiration. "Mrs. Keller," she said, "what you did last night was remarkable." Ruth said nothing. Marla continued anyway. Southern Ridge wants to move forward with the contract. Daniel's shoulders loosened before he could stop them. But there are changes, Marla said. Given the survival rate of your bloom, we are prepared to raise the purchase price on this year's crop. How much? Daniel asked. 22% above the original offer. The number landed like rain on dry ground. Daniel looked at his mother. Ruth saw the calculation move across his face. Fertilizer note, bank extension, roof repair, insurance, taxes. Maybe even enough left to hire help before harvest. A man could forgive many things for 22%. Marla opened her tablet. In exchange, Southern Ridge would need an exclusive purchasing agreement and temporary custody of the Frost Journal for historical review and preservation. Ruth's eyes lifted. There it is, she said. Marla's smile tightened. It is an old agricultural document containing references to our company history. We have a responsibility to preserve it properly. You mean control it. I mean protect it from damage, misunderstanding, and public misinterpretation. Daniel looked between them. Temporary custody for how long? Until our legal and archival team can assess it. Ruth laughed once. Not because it was funny. Because Caleb would have recognized that sentence as a locked door wearing clean clothes. Marla turned toward the orchard. The smudge pots would also need to be removed after this emergency. Last night does not erase liability. Southern Ridge cannot endorse open flame equipment near a commercial crop. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. Marla, those pots just saved the crop you want to buy. And that makes them valuable, Marla said, but not insurable. The man with the black case stepped forward. We can arrange professional documentation. Photographs, measurements, interviews, a heritage package. Mrs. Keller's story could be part of Southern Ridge's regional resilience campaign. Ruth looked at the smudge pots, still black and cold among the trees. A campaign, not a confession. A story with clean edges, company logos, and no unpaid names. Daniel seemed to hear it too, because he did not speak as quickly this time. What about the word Voss in the journal? He asked. Marla's face did not change, but one of the men behind her looked down at his shoes. My family has been in regional agriculture for decades, she said. Names appear in old records. That does not mean wrongdoing. No, Ruth said. But fear usually knows where to stand. Marla closed the tablet. Mrs. Keller, I am trying to help you. The bank will not wait because you found a dirty tag in the mud. A reporter will not save your roof. And if you accuse Southern Ridge publicly without context, you could expose yourself to legal consequences. Daniel stepped closer to his mother then, not fully in front of her, but not beside Marla either. Ruth noticed. After Marla left, the orchard felt colder, though the sun was still high. Daniel did not defend the offer. He did not condemn it. He walked into the packing shed and sat on an overturned crate, staring at the floorboards where Caleb had once chalked harvest counts. 22%, he said. I heard. That saves us. I know. He looked up, tired and angry in a quieter way. Then tell me why it feels like bait. Ruth had no answer that would not hurt him. Instead, she opened Caleb's journal to the loose page. Not frost damage, wage damage. Ask vos. Daniel read it again, slower this time. Did Dad know? Ruth looked toward the shed wall, where Caleb's old scale hung crookedly above the sorting table. Its brass pan was tarnished. Its drawer had not opened in years. I am beginning to think your father knew more than I wanted him to. Daniel followed her eyes. What? Ruth walked to the scale. Caleb had used it every harvest, not because it was the most accurate, but because he trusted its balance. Ruth touched the small drawer beneath the weights. It stuck at first. Then Daniel took a screwdriver from the workbench and gently pried the swollen wood free. Inside was an envelope wrapped in wax paper. Ruth knew Caleb's handwriting before she unfolded it, for when smoke is no longer enough. Her knees weakened. Daniel pulled a chair behind her before she could fall. Inside the envelope were copies of wage slips. Not many, maybe 15. Thin paper, faded ink, names and cabin numbers written in two hands. Ruiz, Arroyo, Bell, Klein, Mercer, Vela. Besides several names were amounts marked held pending review. There was also a photograph. Caleb stood beside Mateo Ruiz near the lower cabins. Both men younger than Ruth remembered them now. Caleb's hand rested on a smudge pot. Mateo's face was turned toward the camera, unsmiling, as if he had already learned that photographs could prove a person had existed. but not that he had been treated fairly. Behind the photo was a letter Caleb had never mailed. State Labor Office. Ruth read only the first line before her eyes blurred. I am writing because what Southern Ridge called worker negligence was not the truth. Daniel stood very still. He tried, Daniel said. Ruth closed her eyes. Yes. Then why didn't he send it? There was the question. The one she had spent years not asking because love is sometimes easier when the dead are allowed to stay simple. Ruth looked at the letter again. The date was 3 weeks before Daniel was born. 3 weeks before Caleb bought the lower acres on company credit. 3 weeks before their family had been given a future built, at least partly, on somebody else's silence. Because he was afraid, she said. Daniel did not answer. Neither did Ruth. For a long moment, the only sound in the packing shed was paper shifting in her hands. Caleb had kept the truth, but he had also kept it hidden. That was not the same thing. Near evening, the local reporter called again. Then Hank. Then Lyle, asking if Ruth would allow him to compare the journal to the county housing survey. 20 minutes later, Miriam Pike from the library left a message saying she had found a possible descendant of Mateo Ruiz, living 2 counties away. Her name was Elena. Ruth listened to the message twice. Then she folded the wage slips back into the envelope, placed Mateo's photograph on top of Caleb's journal, and looked at Daniel. No more guessing, she said. No more letting other people tell us what this means. Daniel nodded slowly. Call Miriam back, Ruth said. Ask her to bring Elena Ruiz here. Elena Ruiz arrived just after sunset in a blue pickup with one headlight dimmer than the other. Ruth watched from the packing shed doorway as the younger woman stepped out slowly, as if she were not sure the ground would welcome her. Elena was in her early 40s, dark-haired, careful-eyed, with a folded canvas bag held against her ribs. She did not look like Mateo from the old photograph at first. Then she turned toward the lower rows. Her face changed. My grandmother used to describe that slope, she said. Ruth felt Daniel look at her. Elena walked closer, but she did not offer her hand right away. Her eyes moved across the shed, the old scale, the journal on the table, and finally the tin tag wrapped in Ruth's handkerchief. Miriam Pike came behind her with 2 boxes from the library. Lyle Pritchard arrived 10 minutes later carrying photocopies of county housing surveys. Nobody called Marla Voss. Not yet. They spread everything across the packing table where Ruth had once sorted peaches with Caleb before dawn. The frost journal, the cabin map, the wage slips, the photograph of Caleb and Mateo, the letter Caleb never mailed, the tag marked Ruiz C4 UNPAID. Elena opened her canvas bag and removed a cracked brown envelope tied with thread. Inside were 3 things: a church baptism card for Mateo's youngest daughter, an old payroll stub, and a photograph of cabin C4 taken from the porch. In that picture, a smudge pot stood beside the steps. Blue mark on the lid. Ruth touched the edge of the photo but did not pick it up. Elena said, My grandfather kept saying they called him careless. My father hated that word. Daniel looked at the wage slips. Who called him that? Southern Ridge, Elena said. The foreman, the company office. Later, anyone who needed work and did not want to stand next to a blamed man. Miriam read from the old housing survey. Wages withheld pending frost review. Lyle placed another page beside it. Here's the insurance filing from the same year. Southern Ridge claimed worker negligence caused improper frost response and crop loss. Ruth looked at Caleb's journal. The page from that year was different from the others. Not neat. Not practical. Caleb's handwriting looked angry in places, faint in others, as if he had stopped and started too many times. Fuel delivery delayed. Pots placed correctly. Mateo warned foreman at 11:40. Pump pressure already low. Company order. Hold reserve fuel for upper blocks. Lower cabins blamed by morning. Elena covered her mouth. Daniel read the last line aloud, but his voice changed before he finished. Not frost damage, wage damage. The packing shed went quiet. The truth did not come like thunder. It came like a door opening on a room that had been locked so long the air inside had gone stale. Southern Ridge had known the workers did not cause the loss. The company had held back fuel from the lower rows to protect the high-value blocks near the ridge. When the lower acres froze, they needed a reason. Worker negligence was easier than admitting management had sacrificed one part of the orchard to save another. Once blame was placed on Mateo Ruiz and the cabin crews, wages could be withheld. Housing could be cleared. Insurance could be claimed. Reputation could survive. People could disappear. Elena took out another paper, worn at the folds. My grandfather tried to get hired in 3 counties after that, she said. The same words followed him. Careless with fire. Unsafe with equipment. My grandmother cleaned houses. My father left school at 14. Ruth lowered herself into a chair. She had known poor years. Everyone in Mercy Valley had. But this was different. This was not bad weather. This was a story powerful people told about powerless people until the lie became their future. Lyle looked sick. The county marked the cabins vacated with no claim, he said. That made it look like they left voluntarily. They were pushed out, Elena said. Miriam opened the last folder. And once the cabins were listed vacant, Southern Ridge requested cleanup approval. No relocation payment, no wage hearing, no housing claim. Daniel stared at Caleb's unsent letter. Dad knew. Ruth closed her eyes. There it was. The sentence she had feared since the first blue mark in the dirt. Yes, Caleb had known enough to write the letter. Enough to copy wage slips. Enough to mark pots and cabins. Enough to save names in a journal when official records began erasing them. But not enough courage to mail the truth. Ruth saw him as he had been then. Young, frightened, soon to be a father, holding a chance to buy the lower acres on company credit. She saw the hunger in both of them for land that would finally be theirs. She saw herself pregnant with Daniel, sewing curtains for a house they did not yet own, believing the future had come because they had earned it cleanly. Maybe Caleb told himself he would send the letter later, after Daniel was born, after the deed was safe, after they had enough money to survive being hated. Later became harvest. Harvest became another year. Another year became silence. And silence became a farm. Ruth pressed both hands flat on the packing table. Daniel whispered, "So this place." He did not finish. He did not have to. Keller Orchard had not been stolen in the simple way land is stolen on paper. Caleb had paid for it. Ruth had worked it. Daniel had grown up under its trees. But the chance to buy it had come at the exact moment another family was being blamed, unpaid, and driven away. That was the stain, not ownership. Origin. Elena did not accuse Ruth. That almost made it worse. She only looked toward the orchard and said, "My grandfather used to say smoke kept the peaches warm and the people invisible." Ruth felt those words enter her like cold. For 9 years after Caleb died, she had believed her promise was to keep the smudge pots because they belonged to him. Then she believed they belonged to the orchard. Now she understood they had never fully belonged to the Kellers at all. They belonged to everyone who had stood in the smoke. Daniel reached for the Southern Ridge offer lying near the edge of the table, 22% above asking. Enough to save the farm for another season, maybe more. No one spoke as he held it. Then he set it down again. Ruth looked at her son, and for the first time in days, he looked back without trying to pull her towards safety. "What do we do?" he asked. Ruth picked up Caleb's unsent letter. The paper trembled in her hand. She could still protect him. She could say he was scared. She could say he meant to do right. She could keep the journal private, sign Marla's contract, sell the peaches, fix the roof, pay the bank, and let the dead remain complicated only inside her own heart. Or she could let the truth have all of him. The loving husband, the frightened young father, the man who preserved the names, the man who failed to speak them when it mattered most. Ruth folded the letter carefully along its old creases. Then she handed it to Elena Ruiz. "This should have been mailed before you were born," Ruth said. Elena stared at the letter. Ruth's voice almost broke, but it held. "I cannot undo what Caleb did not do, but I can stop Southern Ridge from telling this story without the people who paid for it." Daniel stood beside her. Miriam reached for the phone. Lyle gathered the county copies, no longer as an inspector protecting procedure, but as a witness who finally understood what procedure had helped bury. Outside, the last smoke from the smudge pots drifted low through the peach rows. For the first time, Ruth did not think of it as Caleb's smoke. She thought of Mateo Ruiz, Sofia, the Bell boys, the Arroyo family, the Vela children, names she did not yet know, names the valley had once turned into labor, then blame, then absence. Ruth looked at Elena. "Tomorrow," she said, "we put the pots in a row, every marked one, every name we can find, and we let Mercy Valley see what it has been driving past all these years." Elena nodded slowly. This time, when Ruth opened the journal, She did not open it like a widow protecting her husband's memory. She opened it like evidence. The next morning, Ruth Ann Keller did not go to the town hall. She did not want polished wood, county flags, microphones, or officials sitting above people as if truth needed permission to stand. Mercy Valley had hidden too much behind desks already, so she opened the packing shed. Daniel swept the floor before sunrise. Not because anyone had asked him to, but because he could not stand the thought of Elena Ruiz walking through dust and old peach leaves to hear her grandfather's name spoken aloud. He moved crates against the wall, set folding chairs in crooked rows, and dragged Caleb's old scale from the sorting table to the center of the room. Ruth watched him work. There were things a son could not fix with a broom, but there were things he could begin with one. Outside, Hank Bell and two other growers helped Ruth place the smudge pots in a long line beside the shed. Not in frost positions this time. Not according to wind, slope, or cold pockets. According to names. Pot 17 stood first. Ruiz, C4, unpaid. Beside it, Ruth placed the wage slip with Mateo Ruiz's name under a piece of glass from an old storm window. Then came Arroyo, Bell, Klein, Vela, Mercer. Some names had full records, some had only initials from Caleb's journal. Some had cabin numbers but no surname yet. Those hurt Ruth most. A blank space was not emptiness. It was proof of how thoroughly a person could be taken. By 10 o'clock, people began arriving. Not many at first. Hank's wife, Miriam Pike, Lyle Pritchard, 3 growers who had lost most of their bloom, then workers from Bell Orchard, then an older woman who said her aunt had once lived near the lower draw, then a man from the local paper with a camera hanging quietly at his chest. Marla Voss arrived last. She came alone, no company vest, no tablet, no men with clean cases. Just a dark coat, pale face, and the look of someone who had spent the night understanding that silence had a cost even for people who inherited it. Ruth did not greet her. She stood beside Elena Ruiz instead. Elena held Mateo's photograph with both hands. For a moment, Ruth thought she might not be able to speak. Then Elena looked at the row of pots and began. Mateo Ruiz, she said, cabin C4. Her voice shook on the first name, but steadied on the second. Sofia Ruiz. Miguel Ruiz. Rosa Ruiz. The shed went still. Names changed a room. Ruth had always known that at funerals, but this was different. Funerals mourned people everyone agreed had lived. This was closer to pulling someone out of the ground after the world had called the grave empty. Elena read from her family papers. Then from Caleb's journal. Then from the county survey. Miriam added dates. Lyle, to his credit, did not hide behind procedure. He stood in front of people he had known all his life and said the county record did not match the housing survey, the wage slips, or the insurance file. The phrase, vacated no claim, appears to have been used after wages were withheld, he said. That does not prove everything by itself. But it proves enough that this requires formal review. Formal review, Hank Bell muttered. That what we call shame when it's old? Nobody laughed. Daniel stepped forward then. Ruth had not asked him to speak. When he did, her heart tightened because she knew how hard it was for a child to stand beside a parent's failure and not run from it. My father kept these records, Daniel said. He also did not send the letter he wrote. My family bought the lower acres after the Ruiz family, and others were pushed out. We paid for the land, we worked it. But I can't stand here and pretend the timing was clean. Ruth closed her eyes. Daniel's voice caught, but he kept going. I spent this week thinking the smudge pots were going to cost us the farm. Maybe they still will. But if keeping the farm means letting Southern Ridge turn this into a heritage story without the people they hurt, then we don't deserve the word heritage. Marla looked down. Every face turned toward her, but no one called her name. That made the silence worse. Finally, she stepped forward. My grandfather was not the foreman listed in these records, she said, but my family did benefit from Southern Ridge. I benefited from it. And yesterday I tried to take custody of the journal before Mrs. Keller had a chance to understand what it contained. Her voice thin. I told myself it was for preservation. Ruth did not help her. Marla looked at Elena. It was control. Elena's face did not soften. An apology does not pay wages, she said. No, Marla said. It doesn't. She removed a folded paper from her coat pocket and placed it on the old scale. I contacted Southern Ridge Legal this morning. They advised me not to speak publicly. I am speaking anyway. I am requesting an independent review of the 1,967 frost claims, wage records, and housing removals. I am also placing my own signing bonus and this season's management commission into escrow for a restitution fund, pending review. The room shifted. Not forgiveness, something more careful. A first stone moved from a blocked road. Daniel looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at Elena. Elena did not thank Marla. That mattered. Gratitude was not owed for returning a fraction of what should never have been taken. But she nodded once. Hank Bell cleared his throat. My grandmother kept boxes from the old packing office. I never knew what half of it was. I'll bring them. The older woman near the door raised her hand. My aunt's name was Klein. I have a photograph. One of the young workers who had mocked Ruth at the fence stared at the smudge pots, red-faced. My mama's people were mercers, he said quietly. I can ask her. One by one, the room began giving back pieces. Not grand speeches. Boxes, names, receipts, memories, work songs, half remembered. A child in a cabin doorway. A woman who made peach preserves in coffee jars. A man who could sharpen a pruning blade on riverstone. Little scraps that had survived in kitchens and dresser drawers because official paper had failed. Ruth listened to all of it. Then she took the Southern Ridge contract from the table and tore off the signature page. Daniel inhaled sharply, but he did not stop her. We will sell the crop, Ruth said, but not under an exclusive contract that buries this. The first money from the surviving lower rows goes into the workers' fund. After that, we pay what we can pay. The bank won't like that, Daniel said softly. No, Ruth said, but I have lived long enough to know banks dislike many things that still have to be done. A few people smiled then, not because the wound had closed, but because Ruth was still Ruth. Outside, the smudge pots stood black in the morning light. They no longer looked like junk. They looked like witnesses after a long night on the stand. Ruth walked to pot 17 and placed Mateo's photograph beside the tin tag. Then she looked at Elena. Your grandfather saved this orchard once, she said. I am sorry my husband let the valley forget that. Elena's eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. Then don't let them forget again. Ruth nodded. I won't. By evening, the reporter's story had gone out. Not the story Southern Ridge wanted. Not the story Ruth would have chosen if comfort had been the goal. It was messier than that. It named the frost. It named the wages. It named the journal. It named Caleb's letter and his failure to mail it. Most importantly, it named Mateo Ruiz. For the first time in decades, Mercy Valley had to say his name without blaming him. And after everyone left, Ruth stayed in the packing shed with Daniel, Elena, and the row of smudge pots outside the open door. The apology had begun, but Ruth knew apologies were only weather. They passed. What mattered was what the ground grew afterward. By late summer, the peaches that survived the frost were smaller than Ruth Ann Keller had hoped, but they were sweet. That seemed to matter more. Mercy Valley did not become honest all at once. Places rarely did. A newspaper story could name a wrong, but it could not repair every year that wrong had lived inside wages, maps, family stories, and silence. Southern Ridge announced an independent review with careful language and too many commas. Lawyers began sending letters. County officials promised cooperation. Some people called it long overdue. Others called it stirring up the past. Ruth learned that truth, once spoken, did not make everyone grateful. It only made pretending harder. The first restitution checks were small. Painfully small, Daniel thought. Too small to carry the weight of what had been taken. But Elena Ruiz held the first one for a long time before folding it into her purse. It is not the money, she said. Ruth understood. It was the admission. It was paper saying Mateo Ruiz had not imagined the debt. His family had not invented the shame. The word careless no longer belonged to him. That autumn, Daniel fixed the north roof himself. He did it badly at first, then better after Hank Bell came over and showed him how to lay tin without leaving rain a path. He still worried about money. He still opened bank letters with his jaw tight. But he stopped speaking of the orchard as if it were a sick relative everyone needed to apologize for keeping alive. He began waking before dawn. Some mornings, Ruth found him in the lower rows with Caleb's frost journal open against a fence post, studying the blue marks. At first, he treated the pages like instructions. Ridge East. Lower draw. C4. North Hollow. Later, he began adding notes of his own, not over Caleb's handwriting. Beside it, wind shifted 10 minutes earlier this year. Low draw colder after rain. Pot 17 still holds smoke best. The first time Ruth saw Daniel write in the journal, she turned away so he would not see her cry. The packing shed changed too. Not into a museum. Ruth refused that word when the county historical committee suggested it. A museum sounded too still, too polished, too ready to put pain behind glass and call the work finished. Elena called it a living record. That sounded right. One wall of the packing shed held copies of wage slips, cabin maps, photographs, and family names. Another held blank cards where people could add what they knew. Some wrote full histories, some wrote only one sentence. My grandmother picked peaches here. My uncle lived in C2. My mother said smoke made her hair smell for days. Miriam Pike came every Thursday afternoon to help organize the records. Lyle Pritchard brought county boxes he admitted should have been checked years earlier. Hank Bell brought his grandmother's packing office papers in a shoebox that smelled of cedar and dust. Marla Voss came once, alone, and left a folder with Southern Ridge payroll copies from the company archive. Elena accepted the folder without smiling. Ruth did not ask for more than that. Some forgiveness was not Ruth's to give. When the first family came to claim one of the smudge pot lids, Ruth carried it herself from the shed. The lid was from pot 17. Its blue mark had nearly worn away, but enough remained to show Caleb's hand. Daniel had cleaned the rust without polishing off the age. Elena placed the tin tag beside it, then gave both to Mateo Ruiz's oldest living granddaughter. The woman touched the lid, as if touching a doorframe from a house that no longer existed. This stood by C4? She asked. Ruth nodded. And my grandfather stood there? Yes, Ruth said. All night, from what Caleb wrote. The woman closed her eyes. After that, Ruth stopped thinking of the pots as things she was losing. Some stayed in the orchard because they were still needed. Some lids went to families. Some broken bodies were cut apart, and the marked pieces were kept with names, letters, or photographs. The smudge pots did not have to remain whole to remain true. That was something Ruth had learned late. Maybe people were the same. Caleb's memory had not stayed whole either. The perfect husband Ruth had protected in her heart was gone. In his place stood a more difficult man. Loving, frightened, skilled, guilty, and still trying in the only way his courage had allowed. Ruth missed the simpler memory sometimes. But she no longer trusted simple things just because they hurt less. One cold evening in November, a girl named Lena Mercer came to the orchard. She was 17, the same age Ruth had been when she first learned how cold could move like water. Lena's great-grandmother's name had appeared in Caleb's journal with only initials at first. Monsieur Cabinquetre. Later, Miriam found the full name, Maribel Mercer. Lena came because Elena had told her the orchard needed hands that knew how to read more than phones. Ruth liked her immediately because the girl asked questions without pretending to know the answers. What do you look at first? Lena asked. The ground, Ruth said. Not the thermometer? The thermometer tells you what already happened. Ruth led her through the lower draw. Daniel followed with 2 empty pots on the handcart. The trees were bare now, their branches thin against the evening sky. No bloom to save, no crisis, just practice before need. Ruth showed Lena how cold settled at the lowest point first, how damp grass warmed before metal did, how smoke moved differently when the air above was warmer than the air below. She showed her how to touch a bud gently, even when it was only a hard winter knot. She showed her the blue marks and explained that some were for weather, some for memory, and some for both. Lena listened. That was how Ruth knew the valley might yet learn. Near dusk, Daniel set pot 17 beside the lower draw. It was no longer pretty, if it had ever been. Its leg was braced with new iron, its vent still stuck unless opened by hand. Its lid was gone now, given to the Ruiz family, so Daniel had made a plain replacement from scrap tin. No blue mark on it yet. Ruth handed Lena a small brush and a jar of paint. The girl looked surprised. Me? Ruth nodded. You know where it stands now. Lena dipped the brush and painted one careful blue line across the new lid. Not to replace the old mark. To continue it, Daniel lit the pot. The flame caught low. Smoke rose. Hesitated. Then crawled along the ground the way good smoke should. It moved between Ruth's boots, past Daniel's shadow, around Lena Mercer's knees, and down toward the place where cabin C4 had once stood. Ruth opened the frost journal to a blank line beneath Daniel's newest note. Her hand was slower than it used to be, but steady enough. They are remembered. She closed the journal and looked across the orchard. The trees were dark, the air was cold, the bank still existed. The legal review was not finished. Southern Ridge had not yet paid what it owed. There would be more letters, more arguments, more people who preferred the old lie because it asked less of them. But in the lower draw, smoke was moving. A young woman was watching it. Daniel was learning to trust it, and somewhere in that gray ribbon were names Mercy Valley had finally learned to say without shame. The smoke rose slowly between the peach trees, carrying what the valley had once tried to forget,